because sometimes I think people who have mammals like dogs, cats, horses, other small exotic pets see reptiles as something other because they're not as expressive. You know, they have scales instead of fur. Their body language is less expressive. But it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be given the same consideration as these other animals.
I see a lot of kids that are like 18 and they're getting Asian water monitors in the States. And then, you know, they like at 18, you're thinking about what school you're going to go to, what university you're going to go to, if you're going to travel, if you're going to move states for your job. And then what happens to this 6-foot animal? Like, you just expect your mum to take care of it?
And I couldn't believe when I was adding up these numbers, I actually checked my math a couple of times, and sure enough, it came up to $1,600 for what I consider to be the minimum of Ackie monitor husbandry for one animal. It was incredible.
Welcome back to another Roundtable episode. I know these are very popular with the listeners, so I'm happy that we were able to get another one in. And just so you know, there are a few other ones that are being planned right now, so there shouldn't be a huge gap between episode number 3, or Roundtable episode number 3, and Roundtable episode number 4. So just like all Roundtable episodes, we're just going to basically jump right into it. I'll just quickly introduce the guests. Today I'm speaking with Lori from Behavior Education, Mariah from Reptifiles, and Tyson from Habitats at Home. And the discussion today essentially revolves around the question, am I ready for a reptile? So this is just a casual conversation, almost like a brainstorming session where we're coming up with different considerations and questions that new keepers as well as seasoned keepers should be asking themselves before they acquire a new animal. Because even if you're a seasoned keeper, you know, we all get into those habits of just going out and buying new animals without sometimes considering it on a deeper level, asking yourself, is this really the right animal for me? Can I provide this animal everything it needs? Am I going to be able to keep this animal for the rest of its life? All those different things that sometimes we just allow impulse to take over and buy without thinking about it. And then if you're a new keeper, these are all things that you probably haven't even thought about before, and it should really help narrow down choosing the right reptile, either the species or if even a reptile is right for you as a pet. So this brainstorming session is really just a compilation of all of our experience, and we're just taking what we wish we knew when we started and, you know, some of the mistakes that we've made along the way, and hoping we can pass on some of that wisdom we now have to new keepers, or again, even seasoned keepers as well. Now, the really cool thing about this episode is we have a PDF sheet that comes along with it. You can find that in the description below on YouTube or at the show notes. Just head to animalsathomenetwork.com and click on the Roundtable header, click on this episode, and you'll be able to download it to your computer. So the PDF itself is titled Self-Assessment for Choosing the Right Pet Reptile, and it is essentially a distillation of this episode. It just breaks down a bunch of different questions as well as bullet points, and it's just a really nice guide that will help you choose the next reptile species you get and really help you determine whether or not a pet reptile is right for you. Let's jump right into this episode. I hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you once we're done. Okay, well, let's jump into it then. So today, I think just in general, the topic is, am I ready for a reptile, or how do I determine if I'm ready for a reptile? So that's what we want to help people learn, to give you sort of an indication of when that is, when you are ready to move on to actually purchasing an animal. So actually, I think I want to start with maybe Tyson, because Tyson, you came to me with this idea. So maybe you could talk about what sparked you to start thinking about this. I know a comment had kind of triggered your mind to start thinking this after we released our podcast a couple of weeks ago. So maybe you can talk about that and then sort of what this snowballed into.
So someone left a comment on the video or the podcast that we did a couple of weeks ago, and they basically said that people who keep in rats, etc., will often have like select an animal out of the collection to lavish upon, where they have like a bunch of animals in what I would consider substandard conditions, but then they choose an animal to then lavish upon and give a whole bunch of extra things to, and then maybe put that in the living room as a display piece. And that got me thinking that if you then give that animal extra, you know, UV, light, heat, day-night cycle, and all the things that we talk about quite often, it means that you actually know what is required for that animal, and yet you still choose to keep your other animals in substandard conditions. And I think it's almost worse. So I also think that if you have this animal that you're selecting as a type of favorite, chances are that you've got too many, and chances are that you've moved a little bit too quickly, and you've got all these animals that maybe you can't afford to keep, up to that same standard. And I think that's a bit of a problem. I think that before we're actually getting into animals, we need to think about what our end goal is for a collection and what we can manage financially and what our lifestyle can manage. And that basically led me into this topic, which is essentially what you should be thinking about before you are acquiring a reptile as a new keeper, or if you're an experienced keeper that's been keeping for a long time, and you're looking to upgrade your husbandry or your keeping or whatever, and now you're selecting a new animal. What is the process? What you should be thinking about? And quite often we talk a lot about like correct enclosure, correct lighting, correct food, and all of these things that come up in this podcast quite a lot. But I think that the process actually needs to start before that, and you need to consider your lifestyle, your experience, the space you have, the time you have, your financial situation, your stage in life, and other commitments. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're in your early 30s or considering having a child, maybe getting a 6-foot monitor is probably not the best idea, or any reptile really. If you've got a child on the way, for instance, there's a lot of costs involved. Why are you bringing other extra costs of having a reptile in your, into your life at the same time? So it's just making smart choices based on your current situation, and not getting into the situation where you get an animal because you really, really want it, but it doesn't actually suit you. And then 2 years later, you're looking to rehome that animal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the commenter was not necessarily he was more of, or who he or she was more of making an observation, and this is what they see in the hobby. And I totally agree that you'll have somebody, with a bunch of racks and then a single animal that they treat as their pet, and the other ones are just like their project. So, and I kind of like the point, or sort of the point that you're raising here is the process of buying a new reptile. We often start with the reptile. It's like the first step. The way we kind of think about it right now is once you have the reptile, what do you do? But really, there's so many steps before that need to happen. You can't start at the day you're purchasing the animal. There's a bunch of other things that need to happen. So maybe, Lori, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I think those are all great points. And I know I've brought those up in some of the videos I've done, because from somebody who is coming into reptiles, having worked with animals in general for over 30 years, both as a veterinary assistant, as a trainer, and as someone who works in animal rescue, I really hate to see animals who aren't properly cared for and who are rehomed constantly. We have some animals here and we're their 5th or 6th home, and that saddens me so much, because it means that somebody initially got those animals, and I'm sure we're very excited about getting those animals, but then something in their life changed. And so suddenly now they can't have those animals anymore. They don't feel that they can care for them, or they don't want to spend the time to care for them, and they rehome them to someone else. And that happens over and over again. And now some of these animals here, including snakes, not just the dogs and horses we have here, have now been through several homes in their life. And that's obviously, it's stressful for the animal and it's disruptive to them. It's just not fair to them, because you wouldn't do that with your children. You don't have children and then decide, oh, well, now I'm changing jobs, or now I'm moving, or now my finances have changed, so I can't have these kids anymore. Let me just rehome them. And it irritates me that that's the attitude people have about animals in general. And I do see it a lot with reptiles, because sometimes I think people who have mammals like dogs, cats, horses, other small exotic pets, see reptiles as something other, because they're not as expressive. They have scales instead of fur. Their body language is less expressive, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be given the same consideration as these other animals. And I would say that if you're thinking of getting a reptile or any animal, you first need to ask yourself, why do I want to get this animal? Why am I getting it? Then you want to ask yourself, well, what are my expectations of that animal? What does owning this animal or sharing my home with this animal look like in my mind before it's here? When I'm imagining bringing this animal home and having it with me, what do I see in my imagination? What do I see in my mind? What does that look like for me? And what do the interactions look like between me and this animal once I have it home? And you need to answer all of those questions. And then you need to ask yourself, well, what can I offer the animal? What do I have that I can offer the animal in return for all of the things that I'm expecting of it? And then when you've answered all those questions, then you're just getting into these other questions I know we're going to talk about, like what species is correct for me and what type of habitat, am I capable of providing, et cetera. But there's these very preliminary questions that I think people need to answer first. Why am I getting the animal? What are my expectations of it? What does it look like for me to have that animal with me? And what do I have to offer the animal?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So I want to break into that a little bit, but before, I'll let Mariah jump in. If you have any general things you want to say before we get too far into this topic, is there any sort of general comments you have on this topic in general? Obviously, you have being Reptifiles. This is like part of your general base are people that are in this situation. So maybe you want to jump on that.
Yeah, my target audience is usually people who are considering getting an animal for the first time. Or a reptile for the first time. And so my job is to help them prepare. And that often includes a lot of warnings. I find myself using more and more red text in the guides. You're like, this is something you need to be aware of. It just started out as like, here's a shopping list of things that you need, but like, it's more than that. It's adding everything up. And I just finished writing the Ackie Monitor Care Guide, so I guess I'll just put that little plug in for myself right there. Reptifiles has a new guide, and that makes 18 guides on the site. And it's 17,000 words, and it's crazy huge and awesome. But I didn't think that they would be that expensive to set up. I'm like, oh, it's a desert animal, it's not too big. It's a dwarf monitor. Yeah, they need space, but like, how bad could it be? So, I just started crunching the numbers, and one of the things that really throws a wrench into it is Ackie monitors have unique substrate depth requirements because they're highly burrowing oriented in their nature. So that automatically throws out just about any kind of commercially available enclosure. You have to either order custom or build it yourself, and ordering custom is expensive. So all of a sudden you have the general costs of getting an Ackie monitor or getting a small, medium desert reptile. That just doubled to tripled. And I couldn't believe when I was adding up these numbers. I actually checked my math a couple of times, and sure enough, it came up to $1,600 for what I consider to be the minimum of Ackie monitor husbandry for one animal. It was incredible. So expense is definitely a big factor that needs to be considered. More people think that reptiles are cheap because that's how they've been perceived for a long time, is you want a cheap pet to give little Billy for his 8th birthday and so you get, a 10-gallon tank, a green anole with a food dish and a water dish, and it dies 2 months later. At most. So, and I think it comes down to treating them like objects. We think that, it's a one-time investment, or just you buy the animal and maybe like a couple of accessories for it, and that's it. But they're not objects. They're not toys that we play for. It's not a video game system or some kind of action figure with a lot of little optional accessories that you can use to make it cooler. It's an animal with specific needs that must be met in a certain way. And they care if those needs are not met. It's not just a physical health thing, although physical health is important, but lack of physical health will affect their mental state as well, because it affects their quality of life. And that really becomes the line between, say, this is a harsh phrase to use, but the line between animal abuse and responsible pet keeping. There was an interesting discussion on one of the reptile groups lately. Actually, it may have been started by you, Dillon, or in one of your posts about pets versus collections when it comes to the language that we use with reptiles. And that really hit home for me. I have previously kind of avoided using the word pet because it has certain connotations that I didn't really like, mostly to do with putting toy dogs in sweaters and baby talk. which I don't identify with. But the fact that pet usually denotes kind of a life companion, an animal companion that you treat like a family member, versus collection is for coins and stamps and other things that don't care whether they're shoved in a drawer and not attended to for days, or, you know, you don't do anything with them aside from making sure that they don't lose condition or lose value is huge. And when we change the language, we also change the way that we think about the thing that the language is being used to describe. And last point, Lori, I totally feel you on the irritation of hearing somebody talk about getting rid of their reptile during a certain life change, or just rehoming again and again and again. And I see so many posts because I moderate a local reptile group, and just for where I live in Utah. And I see so many posts that I have to filter out because Facebook no longer allows animal sales, but people still try. And they're like, I'm having a baby, I'm moving, I'm who knows what else. But they're always giving these excuses about why they need to get rid of their reptile. And 9 out of 10 times, the excuses are lousy. It's like, really? You already committed your life to this animal. You have a general idea of its care by now, and you really think that you can't keep it in your life anymore just because something's changing? Like, okay, you're moving. That can be uncomfortable for the reptile. They'll survive it as long as you do it right. Like, it's not going to scar them permanently. And why are you concerned? There's a hypocrisy there too, because you don't want to displace them by moving, but rehoming them is also a massive displacement because you have no idea the quality of care that they're going to receive in their new home. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know if that person is just a reptile flipper who is going to shove them in a box and then sell them to the highest bidder. You have no idea what's going to happen. It's totally out of your control. And either way, it has to adjust to a new home. So why not just keep it with you and maintain that consistency? So it drives me nuts. Every time I see those posts, I just want to reach out to the person and be like have some kind of intervention meeting of like, tell me exactly why you think you can no longer have this animal in your life. Second question, do you have any other pets? Oh, you have a dog or a cat? Why aren't you getting rid of that one too? Oh, because they're my dog or my cat. And, well, they're my friend. They're my best friend. I've had them for so long. And why is the reptile different exactly? And of course, that's really, really aggressive and confrontational. And people tend to really shut down and block and possibly even call police. So you can't really do that kind of thing.
Well, I think you're hitting those sort of two really key points with the reptile hobby in general that really frustrated me. One is the implication that it's a cheap hobby. It's said all the time. It's very inexpensive to get into it. I really don't like that. And then the second thing is that sort of trading mentality where it's like, I got these new animals and it's going to kind of flip-flop. As I progress through the next 5 or 10 years, I might have a totally different group of animals. So I think what we'll start with is the lifestyle stuff, because I think that's kind of that's the earliest part of this phase. So maybe Tyson, you can jump in here. What do you think are some key parts of somebody's life that they should have, that they should consider when they are thinking about adding a reptile to their home?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, look, down in the Southern Hemisphere here, Australia and New Zealand, traveling is really, really important. Now, I know it's not such a big thing in the States, at least traveling outside of the country, but here it's we call it an OE, and it's a bit of a rite of passage that either after school and before you start university, you'll travel, or after university, before you start a job, you will travel. And I think that a lot of that stuff is good to get out of the way first. Like I'm in my early 30s. I spent my whole 20s traveling the world, and during that time, I just couldn't keep reptiles, even though I wanted to. I just couldn't, because I knew that I would have to rehome them. Another thing is, and the other thing too is that if you're I see a lot of kids that are like 18 and they're getting Asian water monitors in the States. And then, they like at 18, you're thinking about what school you're going to go to, what university you're going to go to, if you're going to travel, if you're going to move states for your job. And then what happens to this 6-foot animal? Like, you just expect your mum to take care of it. Like, my mum's been supportive of me my whole life when it comes to reptiles, but I would never leave Doc with her. That would just be totally unfair on Doc and my mother. Like, it's not my mother's decision to keep a 3.5-foot lizard. So definitely getting any life events and early life things out of the way first before you start amassing a giant collection is definitely very important. While you're studying and things like that, it's potentially not a good idea. Like, smaller animals, or particular animals might require a less amount of care, but larger animals, like anything large, anything that requires any extra work, extra lighting, extra anything, that requires money. If you're studying and you have an animal that requires a lot of money, it means you need to do a lot of work. And you see a lot of people saying like, oh, I would always make sure my animals are fed before me. And that's just ridiculous. Like, what a dumb thing to say. I'm sorry, but it's just, I know it sounds cool, but it's dumb, man. Like, feed yourself first, feed yourself. Don't buy an animal if it means you have to choose whether you feed yourself or the animal. Like, so many little things like this. Like, if you're, again, financially, if you've got your couch on hire purchase and your TV on hire purchase, and you're making a weekly car payment on some $30,000 car, and you're renting, and you're having to pay for study, and you work at Domino's, then maybe getting a large monitor lizard isn't the right animal for you. So having your finances sorted out is really, really important when you're getting into the more advanced species, or especially the largest species. Mariah mentioned like lighting for an Aki, or enclosure size for an Aki. And obviously, getting larger custom enclosures is more expensive, but it's basic things. Monitors require a lot more heat. And the difference between heating something to 32 degrees Celsius and 65 degrees Celsius is double the wattage, or double the lights. It's double the upkeep. We don't talk about UV light having to be replaced every 6 months. Like, I don't know what they cost for you, but here it's basically $60 every 6 months. And when you multiply that by, say, 10 enclosures, you're talking about $600 every 6 months. So you really need to have your financial situation in order before you're keeping, especially some of the larger species or larger collections. And again, just space. Like, space is something that I really struggled with. Before, in my old place, I had all my reptiles in my workshop. I was so limited on space. And you've always got to have the end game in mind. So here I buy a lizard and it's this big, but it's going to be, 6 foot. Most animals attain their full size within, or at least 75% of their first size within the first 2 to 3 years. So you've got to understand that, like, your situation, I guess if you own your house, for instance, or if you're at a stage of your life where you're a lot more settled, then it's a lot easier. But if you're young and you're renting, or you're trying to work out where you're going to go for school, like, you have to think like this 1 foot animal now is going to be 6 foot in 3 years, and where are you going to put a 6 foot enclosure? Especially if you, like, I move around a lot, so all my enclosures have to be 2 foot wide. We've spoken about this before. It's so limiting. I really, really want a Panoptes, an Argus monitor. It's like, I really, really want one, but I just do not have the space. Like, I've spent weeks now trying to work out how I can build a 2-part enclosure that attaches together, that's in 2 2-foot pieces that I can turn sideways and put through the door and then flatten out. And it's just can't be done. It just can't be done in a realistic way. So guess what? I can't have a Panoptes.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we got to really think about these things.
Well, and I think even smaller species like a bearded dragon or an Aki, for example, like, those are still going to need that 4, 5, 6 foot enclosure as well. So when you do buy the little bearded dragon from the pet store, you do need that space. And I think one other thing to consider too is who you're living with. Maybe even if you have a smaller species of gecko, if you are someone that travels, like when I started keeping, I was a swimmer, so I competitively left all the time to go compete, but I was comfortable with my mom. I only had the one gecko, so walking through with her how to mix the food and feed the gecko wasn't a huge deal. But you need to have those conversations. It's like, okay, I'm someone who travels all the time. Hey mom, are you comfortable feeding this animal when I'm gone every 5 or 6 weekends or so? So Lori, it looks like you're taking mad notes over there.
Yeah, I wrote a few things down. And you guys touched on some of them, but it's very important to not only think about your situation now, but think about future situations that could occur. So you've got to consider what could occur in your life in the future and the longevity of that animal, because some of the snakes that I keep probably are going to live 20 or 30 years. And I need to keep in mind that if I expect to be able to care for that animal for its life, like I don't imagine still getting snakes when I'm older. I don't want to die before my animals. I want to always be here to be able to care for my animals. And so that's one of the things that I feel it's important to consider is how long is that animal going to live? And am I going to be physically healthy and capable of caring for it for its life? But you also need to think about how the space considerations are going to change. I know that when I started doing that initial Bredli behavior study on the Morelia Bredli, that I bought 10 babies that were all the same age from different breeders, and I set them up in identical enclosures, and I was doing ethograms on them and studying behavior, and they were in small terrariums. And I started buying larger enclosures, and some are still in boxes. And my husband was asking me, why are we getting all these enclosures? Why do we need all these enclosures? And where are you putting these? And I was very stressed about the animals growing to their adult size. And if I waited to get the enclosures then, I maybe wouldn't have the money then. And so I was buying the enclosures for these adult snakes while I had the money, and I was just storing them in boxes until they were needed, because that was a big concern for me. When these animals grow larger, what if I don't have the money to get the enclosure? Then I should get it now while I can't afford it. So you've got to think about that. And I always try to stay ahead of the size of the snake. Like I always want to have available enclosures that are bigger than I need at the moment, because I don't want to be caught up in a situation that I hear from so many people. Oh, this snake's ready to move up to this size enclosure. I need to do that soon. Well, you should have already done it then. Like, why weren't you planning ahead? Because now the animal is in too small of an enclosure. And the other thing that needs to be considered is health and veterinary care. And you might get an animal that's perfectly healthy and something happens to it. And are you prepared to care for it? Are you prepared to spend the money on the vet bill? And I can tell you, because I work with different species of animals, dogs, cats, horses, birds. We've had sheep and goats and llamas and the snakes, that really the average vet bills are not going to be any different for a reptile. And in some cases, maybe more expensive if you have to go to a specialist than they're going to be for your dog or cat. So we had a coastal carpet python that had to have a cancerous tumor removed from between his esophagus and stomach. And it was about a $1,200 surgery. And I actually thought that was very reasonable, because I've spent more than that on surgeries for other animals. You have to think about, what if this animal gets sick? What if it needs surgery? How am I going to pay for it? And we do that by either, I have a credit card that is set aside strictly for animal emergencies, and I don't use it for anything else. So I don't keep a balance on it. It's there if I have a vet emergency. And then I also try to build up a savings account for veterinary emergencies. And that tends to go up and down, because I'll also use that for routine care. But I definitely have a credit card. It's put away in a drawer, and it is not touched unless we have an emergency. And so whatever your solution is, whether it's a savings account ahead of time or one credit card you keep just for that, you've got to think about that medical care if an emergency happens, because you can't just leave an animal sitting at your home in distress or in pain or having an illness that needs to be treated. You can't just let it sit there and suffer and die.
Yeah, and so this is really highlighting the issue with getting an animal and another animal and another animal. So you don't realize, if you like for instance, I've never had to have a surgery on one of my animals. I wouldn't even know how much a surgery would cost. So I could go 10, 15 years and you're slowly kind of just getting used to the fact that you don't have to pay for a vet bill. So you don't have that buffer zone because you're never thinking about it. And, we talked about kind of before we officially started that probably all of us have made these mistakes in the past. So we're hoping to highlight some of these, even my enclosures, my snake enclosures, I want to upgrade them. And I'm just like, I don't even have space anymore because I'm in an apartment, and really I wanted to buy a house last year, and then who knew that COVID was going to happen? So, those sort of things where I didn't plan ahead. Like I should have waited until I had a house before I had snakes that needed larger enclosures than I could, have in my apartment type thing. So Mariah, do you have anything to say on sort of the lifestyle points?
Totally. Work schedule is something to consider. So I just recently moved, from a normal 8 to 5 job early last year. And then last summer, I switched to working from home. And all of a sudden, I was seeing my reptiles more, and I was able to take care of them during the day. And I was realizing just how much I hadn't been doing for them before, and how much the way that my care for them had suffered because of my limited time. Because it wasn't just me, heading off to work in the morning and then coming home at night when they're like winding down for the day. It was also, before COVID, I was volunteering teaching martial arts at a local school 3 nights a week. I had all these other activities that were taking me away from home. I was barely seeing my reptiles and barely taking care of them. Like the most time I would be able to spend with them was on the weekends. And that is something to consider, is how does your lifestyle, like how much time do you actually have to dedicate to them? And if you think, oh, I can fit them in here and there, are you really though? Is that really going to be the forefront thing on your mind, is, oh, I really got to squeeze in that? Or is their care going to fall by the wayside because you're just too busy to think about them? And all of a sudden their water dish has been empty for 2 days, and you just realize it and go, or you have been so busy, or they're in a different room in your house that you don't often go to, I don't know, a garage or just a spare bedroom or a basement. And you check in on them and their heat lamp has been out for a few days, things like that, where you're not able to check on them on a regular basis is huge. And sometimes, and knowing the way that your house is a big deal too. Something else I noticed was just how hot my apartment gets during the day. I live in an upstairs apartment directly under, it's not well insulated, and it's directly underneath a black asphalt shingle roof that is amazing at amassing heat in this alpine sun that just is strong at all times of year. And in the summer, it's killer. I mean, my apartment can easily get to 85, 90 degrees, no problem. Cooling is, let's see, I can't even remember what my electric bill was this summer. It was hot, it was dry, and it was relentless. And I was running 2 or 3 air conditioners in a 700 square foot apartment 24/7, just to try to keep the place at a livable temperature. And I wasn't really doing that before I was in the apartment and realizing I need to live in here. And I'm starting to sweat at 80 degrees. This is uncomfortable. How has it been for the reptiles that already have these heating implements that I haven't been checking as diligently before? Things that I totally took for granted. So thank goodness for smart tech. But those are things to consider. When you're actually there, you can actually experience it for yourself, and you have a much better idea of what they're experiencing. Also, how noisy is your house is another thing to consider. Like people with, 6 kids who are running around screaming at all times of day, that can be really traumatic for a reptile that, generally doesn't like excessive vibrations in their environment and, doesn't like noise. Can they get used to it? Totally. But we have to keep in mind that reptiles they're just kind of like introverts, you got to take care of them. You just make sure that they're not too too overwhelmed or overstimulated, just make sure that they have their quiet space, they have their needs met, check in every once in a while, but very much do things on their terms. There are precious little introverts. They don't like being in the middle of the action. What else? There so many great points have been made. Proximity to a vet is another thing that I thought of. Reptile vets are not exactly common, and a good reptile vet is even less common. Fortunately, here in the US, we're really used to driving long distances on a routine compared to, say, like in the UK, where you can throw a stone and you can find another vet practically. I know it's not that way, but that was the impression that I kind of gained when I was compiling my list of reptile vets in the UK. I'm just like, there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one. And then people are complaining about, it's so far away. And I'm like, don't even get me started. But I live 1 hour away from a great vet. 1 hour is not that bad, but it is still a little bit prohibitive when I have to think about, okay, I've got all of these animals, and it is not practical for me to box them all up and haul them an hour up to the vet for like repetitive appointments just for a checkup. That right there, what is generally considered a small collection of reptiles is already a major inconvenience when it comes to taking care of their health. So that's a stressor right there. Or if I'm concerned about something that's immediate, like when my bearded dragon had for lack of better words, best thing that me and the vet were able to come up with was probably heart attack. The vet was an hour away, and there was no one closer that I trusted to look at her sooner. So I had to do CPR to get her to a point where I thought she was relatively stable, and then speed all the way up to the vet and, maybe take off 15 minutes of the drive time and hope that it didn't get pulled over, but being very prepared to just like yell at a police officer and be like, I've got a dying animal. But like they would care. But it's a major inconvenience. So thinking about your proximity to these important places is just as important as when you're choosing a house and, okay, where's the grocery store? Where's the gas station? All of the amenities that you consider for yourself also need to be considered for your reptile. Something that I had not considered before I met Lori was time commitment for reptile training. How much time do you have per day for regularly handling and training or just interacting with, creating positive interactions with your reptiles on a regular basis? That's time consuming. I'm able to overlap with my work schedule since I work from home, but like spending time individually with each of them to say, okay, I'm going to sit here and watch you while the door to your enclosure is open because you are a snake, and if I let you out of my sight, I'm not going to see you for the next 2 days, possibly. I have to just be present in that place, not really doing other things while that is open and they're doing their thing. Or I have to, for more active training exercises, you have to be present, or you at least have to be supervising in some way. So there's a time commitment even just to basic handling. And again, you can go, if you're super busy, you can go weeks without handling or interacting with your reptile in any way aside from throwing in food and changing out the water. It's incredible. And then all of a sudden you're like, why does my reptile act scared of me? Oh, gee, because it hasn't seen you in forever? Maybe that? It thought you stopped existing? So that's a consideration. And the two last things here. One, just your landlord. If you rent, I see this so many times and it drives me batty. It's, okay, I live in an apartment and I want a reptile, but my landlord says no reptiles. So can I have a reptile? No, you can't have a reptile. It's just like if the landlord says no smoking in your apartment, you don't smoke in your apartment. it's just like that. But no, they're like, oh yeah, sure. No, you just hide it from the landlord. What? Okay, what if you get the reptile? The landlord finds out. Turns out they do care about the fact that you have a reptile, even though, yes, okay, it's not a dog or a cat. And regardless of your long list of reasons why the landlord's being stupid about not allowing reptiles, you could find yourself having to give away the animal immediately, or you could find yourself evicted on the spot. That's bad. That's really, really bad. And yet you see people all the time when they post to forums, they say, all right, so how can I hide my reptile from my landlord? And you, instead of people saying, you do see, fortunately, some people being reasonable about this, but you see a lot of people saying, oh yeah, here's ways to do it. This is how I did it. And this is our reptile community enabling people to make the reptile community look really, really bad, to break rules and just be bad tenants, bad citizens, do things that are generally irresponsible. That's horrifying to me. So if you're thinking about getting a reptile, talk to your landlord. Open up a line of communication. Yes, it can be scary and it sucks talking on the phone, but you need to be able to at least get their permission in some way, shape, or form. When I wanted to get a bearded dragon, like I've done many not great things in my, I think about 10 years cumulatively of keeping reptiles at this point. But one of the best things I did was when I wanted to get a pet bearded dragon, I looked at the contract for my apartment, noticed no pets, then called up my landlord and said, okay, how do you feel about small animals in cages that don't free roam around the house? They don't shed, they don't make noise. And they're like, can you give an example? I'm like, kind of like a fish. And like, well, the water's a concern there. And I'm like, okay, how about not a fish? Like not a big lizard. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. And it was as simple as that. And then later on, I got my reptiles written into my contract. So my contract actually, it specifically states that I'm okay to keep reptiles in my apartment. And since I have these great enclosures, when my landlord comes in for an inspection, I don't have to panic. I'm just like, hey, you got to see how beautiful these enclosures are and look at how well I'm taking care of them and how that reflects on me as a good tenant and the way that I'm being responsible in my life. So it just changes everything, just your relationship with your landlord, and it changes things for the reptile community as a whole in improving our general reputation. The last thing is kind of a step back from that is just the practical discussion of food. Are you comfortable with feeding the reptile the type of food that it needs? There are so many people, I get these emails and they're like, okay, so I really, really want a leopard gecko, but because they're really, really cute, but I can't stand bugs. And it's like, well, the leopard gecko is not a good pet for you then. I'm sorry. Or they say, oh, my family member doesn't like bugs, or my mom. It's usually a teenager who's reaching out to me about this. And like, if bugs are a no-go, you can't keep an insectivore. Sometimes you can get away with pre-killed insects like vacuum sealed or canned, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to be comfortable with bugs and be able to use them on a regular basis. Same for snakes. If you are a vegan, but you like snakes, I don't understand why. That's kind of, to me, I don't see how they overlap, but it's happened. And like, I really don't want to feed animals to my snake because I feel that's bad and cruel. Why do you want a snake then? It's like, you can't feed it meat alternatives. Humans are omnivores. We do fine with plant protein. We can assimilate it, we can use it, it's good. Snakes are carnivores. They have an entirely different evolution. They have an entirely different physiology, and they don't respond in the same way to plant-based protein. Also, it's much harder to get this animal that's designed to eat whole prey to eat the kind of diverse diet, the diverse plant-based diet, even assuming that they could, that it would take to replace the nutritional content of a whole animal. Okay, I did say that was the last thing, but like, same with the landlord thing. Make sure your family members are okay with the pet that you're getting. Don't try to hide it from your mom and think that it's going to work. Because let's be honest, when has that ever worked? You can't hide it from a family member. If you have a family member who hates snakes, as ignorant as that might be, okay, try educating them. If it still doesn't work, wait until you move out. Or respect your spouse's wishes. Don't just decide to go and do your own thing, because again, eventually you might have to get rid of it, and you just created a problem for you, and you just created a problem for your animal that never had to exist in the first place. Okay, I'm done. That was a long rant.
Those are some great points. I think you're looking into my past and you're scolding me for things that I've done. I have definitely read between the lines on Elise before. It worked out fine in the end, and I definitely brought my first snake home when my mom said no snakes. But I thought that's how you get your foot in the door. But no, I go with what Mariah is saying. I totally agree. Those are great. So I think that is a ton of lifestyle points. Points that are really important to take in consideration. Where are you? Like, some people listening to this are going to be still living at home, their kids. Have that conversation with your family. Understand how much time, how much money it's going to take. Do you travel? Are you away? How much? These are a commitment. It's not a pet rock. So this might be too vague of a question, but just to stick on the money point for one more second here, if someone were to say, how much money do I need to keep a reptile? This is too vague because the species obviously is very dependent on that, but is there a way that you could guide people to say how much money they should have? I don't know, Tyson, do you have any points on that? We can kind of wrap around real quick if anybody has points on the money thing.
Yeah, I think it's expectation of what you get for your money. Now, I think you can definitely go to a pet shop and you can get some starter kit. I don't know what they are over in the States, but here most bearded dragon starter kits are probably around the $1,000 mark, and they give you a whole bunch of stuff that you don't need, and the stuff they do give you is not really the highest quality, and the enclosure is too small, but they'll tell you it's going to last for the first couple of years. So, whenever you see a starter kit, avoid it. You can definitely get those same things for much cheaper and much better. I think it's important to understand that an enclosure for a $50 snake and an enclosure for a $30,000 snake should be the same. It's not relative to the price that you pay for the snake. And also, there's a lot of things that are just basic necessities: lighting, heat, enclosure. All of these basic things that we've covered many times before. And then where the cost really comes in is into aesthetics. Now, I get a lot of people, they say, look, wow, your enclosure for Doc is really, really amazing. And, I say, thank you. But, a lot of this stuff's not necessary. It's what I like. It's what I strive for. I'm trying to make a little slice of what it would look like in the Kimberleys, say. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary. You can get the same, you won't get the same aesthetic, but you can get the same result out of just wooden platforms and things like that it's a lot more basic, a lot more easier to keep clean, a lot less maintenance. So don't feel like just because you're not you don't have universal rock backgrounds or mock rock backgrounds or foam backgrounds or whatever, that you're not meeting their requirements. I wouldn't want anyone to think that at all. And money, like I said, savings, like in terms of vet, and whenever there's a problem happens, like money in this hobby will get you out of a lot of trouble very, very quickly. If you have a power surge and a whole bunch of your light bulbs go out, you want to be in a situation where you can replace them all in one go, and not thinking, oh, can I eat tonight, or do I replace a light bulb? Which is, you see so much stuff like that where it's like, I've got to do this, but I've got to do this. And it's like, if you're in that situation, then you really need to be planning ahead, having a bit of an emergency fund for vets, for replacing lights and things like that. But you can definitely do things a lot cheaper. But I reckon the entry level to most reptiles, like if I'm getting a new reptile, I have to factor in between $1,000 to $1,500 as an entry level. Like I've got to have that in the bank ready to go before I get a new animal. And that's just to do things the way that I like to do it. Mm-hmm. It's not, everybody's different. I don't know what things cost over there, but I know what I need. I've got a bit of a budget. I know that to get an enclosure to the point where I want to get it, I need between $1,000 and $1,500. So I save that ahead of time.
And what do you think, Lori, as far as like I guess a setup thing, probably a couple $100 for sure. Like I would say, like getting into the over 1,000, like Tyson's saying, is getting that really nice kind of zoo level exhibit.
Exchange rate though. Sorry,
yes, exactly. So 1,000 is more like 700.
Yeah, 600 or so American. So
exactly, and yeah, I think the Canadian dollar is pretty close to the Aussie, but obviously, yeah, we're like 70 cents or something on the American. And then I don't know. So you can touch on that as well, Lori. But also, I was thinking about would it be fair to say like it doesn't matter what species you have, you should plan at least like $50 a month of animal expenses? Is that way too much or is that way too little? It's hard for me to say because I easily spend that, but I have more animals. So Laura, you can jump in.
When I look at getting an animal now, let's say a snake, I'm looking now at it much differently than I did 35 years ago when I got my first snake. When I got my first snake, it was sort of by accident. The Humane Society brought it into the vet I was working at. Somebody had abandoned it in an apartment and they were going to have to find a home for it. And I ended up kind of holding the snake all day and just messing with it. And they said, hey, you can keep it if you want. And I didn't have other reptiles at that time, but I was like, yeah, I would love to have the snake. So I think on my lunch break, I went and bought a book about the snake. I think it was a ball python. It's been a long time ago. So I read the book before I get off work while I'm working. And then I buy everything I need on the way home and I get home with the snake and I set it all up. And that was minimum. So now I think of the maximum. When I'm thinking of budgeting for a snake, I'm thinking of not what's it going to cost to set up right now, because, you know, like a baby Bredli, I had them in small terrariums. And that wasn't very expensive to buy. I could buy a small terrarium for $75 and put a lot of enrichment in it for very cheap. And it's tiny. But now when they're adults, they need a lot more. And so I'm looking at it now as when it's an adult and it needs a 6 or 8 foot enclosure. How much is that going to cost? How much is this adult food going to cost? How much is a medical bill going to cost if like the worst case scenario happens and it needs a surgery? And I make sure that in the foreseeable future, I will be able to afford that. So I kind of skip the entry level cost because honestly, entry level cost isn't that much, at least from my perspective. But it's the ongoing cost and okay, once this animal's an adult or if something happens to it, what's the cost going to be? And so that's what I try to budget around. Not the initial cost, but kind of the ultimate cost. And it's hard to estimate that. I mean, I always look at a surgery minimum is going to be $1,200 to $3,500, whether it's a dog, cat, horse, snake. And so that's the minimum that I try to make sure that I have in savings before I get one, because that's my worst nightmare. And I guess it's just because I work at an animal sanctuary. We have to have surgeries on animals, and I deal with that a lot, that I never want to not be able to pay for a surgery if an animal needs one. So I guess I always budget around ultimate enclosure needs and ultimate vet bills when I look at costs, because I never want to be caught in a situation where I can't take the animal to the vet and get the care it needs, or where it outgrows the enclosure and now it's smushed in one that's too small.
Can I just say on that as well, just a little anecdote from my side. When I got Greg, my Maclay's turtle, about 4 weeks after we got him from an expo, we noticed that there was something going on with his shell. And it ended up being a little bit of shell rot. Now, what I could have done is taken Greg back to the breeder and said, hey, I think you've given me a turtle that's got a bit of a shell issue. And the breeder would have, I think, happily would have taken it back, and as a responsible breeder should. However, you know, being in my sort of situation where when an animal comes into this room, it's family. You know, I can't imagine giving any of them up unless there was some situation that really, really, really called for it. Now, I paid $95 for that turtle, but I probably spent around $600 on it within the first 4 or 5 months, and the amount of time that it took to rehabilitate it and all the extra medication and things like that was required, and all the other things I had to go out and get. Now,
because I was prepared, and because I have an emergency fund for my animals, I was, it was annoying. I didn't want to spend that money, but it didn't affect my life at all. Like it didn't, the money, that's what the money's there for. Like but when I put that money aside, it's spent. Like in my mind, it's spent already. So I was able to, we love Greg. Greg's family. I love seeing that little turtle swimming around. I would never have given him back. As soon as he was in our house, he was ours. I wasn't going to just offload him as if he wasn't my problem. So yeah, like I was saying, like being prepared and having these funds just means that when one of your loved animals has a problem, like it doesn't change. It didn't affect my life in any way. I wasn't thinking, oh, how am I going to make this payment? Because I've got to make this payment. The money was already there. And Greg's, he's got a scar, but he's happy and healthy now. And I'm so happy that he's still with us, scars and all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. You don't want to have the difficult financial discussion when you're in an emergency situation. You just want to go to the vet and get it taken care of and not have to think, how am I going to, I'm going to have to cancel the cable bill or something like this to be able to make that work. Mariah, do you have anything to touch on to the financial side?
Yeah. First, I want to say, Tyson, did I hear you correctly when you said that you could get a bearded dragon starter kit for $1,000 in Australia?
Yeah, $1,000 to $1,200, I think, gets you like a 3-foot Exoterra, something like that.
Okay, yeah. So I don't know if you saw my jaw drop when you first mentioned that, because here a starter kit is like $100 to $200 USD. I've seen them as cheap as $60. They are bad. I mean, some of them are really, really bad. So hearing $1,000 starter kit actually sounds like a dream to me, because that sounds like something that could actually come close to being adequate.
The thing is that it's the same starter kit that you get. It just has to get shipped to Australia. And then the exchange rate. It's no difference. It's a dome, a coiled UV, some incandescent, well, not incandescent, but like a halogen lamp, a UV tube, and an open top glass Exoterra or local brand. And it'll generally just be a bag of sand, a water dish. Yeah, it's not good by any means.
Oh, did we lose Mariah for a second?
Yeah, I think we might have lost her.
She looks frozen.
Yeah, she's so shocked. She had to leave. Everyone else was so still. I couldn't tell if it was me that was frozen or was her. We'll give her a second to come back.
Yeah, with enclosures, and like we were talking about how, like in our podcast, we said that I think that's too small. Another point that we should make is that I hear, like you see it all the time. It's like, oh, I've got my retic or my monitor is getting larger. I need a new enclosure. My uncle's going to build it, or my dad's going to build it, or my brother is a builder. He's going to build it. You really need to make sure that these people that you're expecting to build your enclosure know about it before you buy an animal. You know, like I'm an electrician. If you come to me and say, oh, I've bought a house, can you wire my house for me? The answer is no.
Exactly.
Like, I'm busy, man. Like I got stuff. I got my own problems. I'm not building your snake in enclosure. You know,
it's not a small project.
Yeah, it's not a small project. And you're also asking somebody who has no idea about what's actually required to build a box for you, you know?
Exactly.
So don't, like, really, when it comes to, this is another point, when you're getting into these more advanced animals, these larger animals, starting with a smaller animal and learning how to build enclosures at a small scale is the best thing that you can do for your hobby. Mm-hmm. Like, I always think about, like, I am a reptile keeper, a reptile hobbyist. I will keep reptiles for the rest of my life. So I make small things, like I make small decisions now, knowing that by the time in 10 years time, like I'm going to be really proficient at it. This idea that you're going to get something the first go, or that the first time you try something, it's going to be perfect, or that it has to be perfect is ridiculous. You know, like you can see, like this is 14 years worth of work culminated into one project, and there's still changes that I would make to it. So and this is coming from an enclosure builder. Like, you can pay someone like me to build you an enclosure, but build it yourself. Like, learn how to build it yourself. Like, it's the best thing that you can do, and then if there's something that, you can always ask people, like, different things that you can do, but the best thing that you can do for your hobby, especially when it comes to keeping larger species, is learn how to do it yourself. Because, to pay for something like that is going to cost you a lot of money. And it's not even materials, it's time. A lot of time goes into it, especially if you want something unique in terms of design. So, there's such a massive cost. You start getting into the thousands of dollars for an enclosure for a lizard that you might pay $400 for. The enclosure costs $4,000 just to the sheer size, and then there's so many added costs. Heating in an enclosure that size, glass. That's $400 worth of glass, just those 2 panes.
Oh yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's just, plus the fish tank, $800.
Well, and this is where
the cheapest thing is the wood, the track, the aluminium track that sits on is $200. Do you know what I mean? And it's just it's not that it's like the highest quality. It's just at that scale, at that size, the price just increases exponentially just to achieve what you're trying to do. At 6 mil, normal glass on an enclosure would be 5 mil thick or polycarbonate. This is 6 mil thick, toughened because of the size. And then at that weight, the track, like, it wouldn't work on plastic track. You have to upgrade to a ball bearing track. And that's the cheaper of the 2 ball bearing tracks. I went for plastic ball bearings, not steel ball bearings, because it was cheaper. It would have cost me $300 and something. So it's just scale. Scale increases cost, and it's not even the highest quality. It's just the reality of trying to do things at scale. So yeah, make sure that if you are trying to get one of these larger animals, that you either have the experience and the ability to do it yourself, or that you do know somebody and that they know ahead of time that this is expected of them. Don't just land it on someone. Don't just land it on someone that they have to build you this amazing, 10 foot by 4 foot, whatever, enclosure.
Yeah, you will get an absolute trash for an enclosure.
Yeah. And yeah, just like I was saying, and I know you felt it too, Dylan, as Mariah was talking about, like, the landlord and about your mum not knowing. Like, I really want to get it across. Like, I don't want this to seem like some round table of elitists. Like, the idea is that, like, as Mariah was talking, I was like, yeah, my first snake I had from my mum. I'm going through a landlord sort of situation in the house that I rent now currently. Like, all of these things. Like, I don't want anyone to think that we're all perfect and that we've never done any of these things. I want everybody to know that we have done these things and we've learnt lessons, and now we're telling you, don't make the same mistakes. Like, it doesn't help you, it doesn't help your animals. The stress of having an animal and not being ready for it, like having an enclosure to put that animal in, like, it affects everything that I do. Like, I can't relax until it's organized. So just what we're saying is, learn from us. Don't make these same mistakes. And if you have made these mistakes, don't think, oh, I'm a terrible keeper, or I've done something wrong, or I can't afford this animal. I'm gonna have to rehome it instantly. Like, as Mariah was saying, like, all these things that you realize and you think, do I have the time? My situation has changed. The answer isn't rehoming. The answer is, how do I adjust my life to fulfill these commitments to this animal that I've already got? Like, a small adjustment. If you're working full time and you're studying in the afternoon and you've got a pet snake, maybe the answer is not joining your local darts club or something. I don't know, whatever, like you're saying, like, I've already got this one commitment, I don't need another commitment. Like, adjusting your life, or one less night at the pub. I'm going to spend that night cleaning my reptiles. There's small adjustments, but the answer isn't rehoming. Unless you've got some sort of, God forbid, illness in the family, or you're like a sudden disability or something, where your physical or financial situation changes drastically, then rehoming is not the answer. You need to be able to adjust your life. And another thing Mariah said at the end before we lost you was about food. So, and we also, this is hand in hand for me in terms of food and barrier for entry, which we talk about a lot. Is I get a lot of messages being like, I've got a Mertens or I've got an Asian water monitor. Where do I get crayfish from? And it's like, well, you really should be lining that up before you buy the animal. If that's the way you intend to go, you really need to be lining that up. And in terms of barrier for entry, maybe it's an American thing. I don't know, but the amount of people that can't work out that I'm not in the same country is unbelievable. Like, it's like if you come to me and say, oh, hey, I want a Mertens, where do I get one from? The first thing I do is go on your page. And if I start seeing ball pythons and things like that, I know you're not in Australia. So it's like a little bit of an intelligence test for me where it's like, all right, man, like I got to really think about how much time I'm going to invest in this, because the most basic thing is working out whether we're even in the same country, you know, like, you know, I send the guy who I get my crayfish from, I send them the website, and it says .com.au. And one of the first things it says on the website is, we do not ship overseas. Like, you know, like we're talking about barrier of entry. And this might sound a bit, I don't know what the word is, but it's like, I kind of feel when you're getting into more advanced animals, or especially a species like a Mertens, which I know, like in Australia, they're around $600 roughly. But in the States, I think they're up in the thousands, low thousands, I think. If you're going to message a stranger and say, where do I get a Mertens, or where did you get your Mertens from? And you can't work out that I'm not in the same country as you. I don't think you have the support around you to do it. Do you know what I mean? Like like we have two websites over here, like Reptiles Down Under and Reptiles Classifieds, where people post reptiles. Obviously, there's no Facebook sales and stuff anymore, but people post their reptiles up there. You know, they're generally like the biggest breeders, or the people that have all of the sort of more niche sort of species. The stuff's already sold before it's hatched generally, so they don't need to advertise. But you know, it's a general place. I go there every day. I just have a little look around, see what's available. You know, so if people ask me where I got Doc from, that's where I got Doc from. But if you can't like work that out, like if you're over there in the States or wherever you are and you don't know where to get animals from, maybe you're not surrounded by the right people, or the right sort of community, or have the people around you with the knowledge required for you to keep that particular animal. Hope I said that right without sounding like too much of a dick, but it's
no, I think you're totally right, especially when it comes to like, hey, I have this animal, where do I get the food from? Like, that is put the cart way in front of the horse there, and that's a bad situation.
Yeah, wasn't it Angelica and Rugrats who said, like, if you have to ask, you'll never know?
yeah, that's,
you know what I mean? It's like if you have to ask, I don't think you're ready.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
just as a barrier for entry. Exactly.
So, Mariah, before you internet shut down, did you have anything that you were about to say? It looked like we were just talking about the what do you call them, starter kits, and then you disappeared. I don't know if you had anything on top of your head that you wanted to rattle off.
Oh yeah, I agreed. Aesthetics is definitely one of the most important, or the most expensive parts of keeping a reptile, setting them up. And I like to be elaborate with my enclosures. I like them to be beautiful, and because my reptile room is kind of my happy place. So there's a lot of expense that just goes into the aesthetic aspect of the enclosure rather than the functional, although aesthetic is also functional. So, or at least it should be. So it gets a little muddled there. But my best advice for anyone looking to get a reptile is start with a big budget. Take what you think you need to spend, take what other people are recommending, and I'm telling you, double it. It is always better. And my husband's in construction, so like we can agree on this. When you're starting a project, overestimate on the budget, because very frequently you're going to end up blowing your original budget anyway. So if you have that wiggle room, that is going to make you so much more comfortable in caring for the animal. And also it makes sure that you're not suddenly strapped for cash and unable to set up a functional enclosure. So that's huge, is just start with a bigger budget. And I don't want to sound like, again, elitist or like, oh, reptiles are only for rich people, but let's acknowledge they are luxuries. They're not necessities, and you need to accept that they have a luxury cost associated with them. One of the biggest things that I was thinking of was the cost of rescue. And it's something I see all too often is people saying, I rescued this bearded dragon. What do I need for it? And I've only got $50. What? It's like, wait, you don't rescue an animal if you can't care for it. You just moved it from one bad situation into another bad situation. And I can definitely speak from experience on the letting your compassion for the animal get the better of you. Because when I got my northern blue-tongued skink, Kairos, it was a weird situation where a friend of mine who's a college professor, he teaches biology at a local university, and that's relevant because he had somebody drop off this blue-tongued skink on his office, like porch or his doorstep to his office, just out of the blue. No context, just a blue-tongued skink in a bin, maybe not even that, like a shoebox. And that was it. And he just texts my husband and because he was on campus, and goes, hey, you guys want another blue-tongued skink? And shows him a picture. My husband is like, all right, Mariah, we are getting another blue-tongued skink. And I'm like, okay. And I see him, and he's in terrible condition. He had overgrown nails. He had a regrown tail. He had this terrible scarring from an oral infection. It looked like he was in some stage of MBD. Just really not the worst shape I've ever seen, but pretty bad shape. And I barely knew what I was doing with reptiles at the time, to be honest. And so we tossed him in a spare 55-gallon tank. I think, oh boy. Okay, confession time, guys. We had recently separated my two bearded dragons that had been cohabited in a 90-gallon tank. We were patting ourselves on the back at that time because, 90 gallons is more than twice the size of the 40-gallon minimum recommendation that everyone had told us. So we're like, yeah, we can totally house two bearded dragons that were previously housed together in this thing. Okay, fine. But they had been starting to have a few issues. I was feeling uncomfortable with cohabiting them, so I split them. And so I actually took one of the bearded dragons out of the 55-gallon tank, put them back in the 90 with the other bearded dragon so that I could have this 55-gallon available to quickly clean out, stick some aspen in a heat, and, repurpose the heat lamp and UV. And no, there was not a UVB, I don't think. Yeah, let's not go into that. Repurpose these things and maybe it was a cheap UVB so that I could toss this blue-tongued skink in there. I did not have the budget for the vet cost to bring him to a vet to get an x-ray to see what was going on with him and what the best course of action would be for rehabilitation. I just started feeding him and stuffing him full of calcium and vitamin D3 and trying to get him to stability. And fortunately, he got better. By some miracle. I mean, this is a testament to the amazing hardiness of blue-tongued skinks, but he survived my bungled rescue effort. Now, I knew very little about basic healthcare for reptiles, for what to do in a kind of rehabilitation situation. So not only did I not have the funds to take the animal to the vet, but I had a lack of experience and education on even what to do if you can't go to the vet. So yikes, that was bad. Now contrast that with an experience I had several years later where a local pet store, I was visiting, and they said, hey, we've got a sandfish skink in really bad shape. Somebody just gave it back to us. They bought it. They ignored it for a couple of months, and it has come back to us totally emaciated. If you are looking for a research project, you are totally free to take this animal, rehabilitate it for a little bit. And so I'm like, great, sandfish skinks. That's something I've never worked with before, but I know a lot more about caring for reptiles now. And so I had to make choices like, okay, can I take this animal to the vet? I can afford it, yes, but it's in delicate condition and it's a likely wild-caught species. It's the trauma of getting examined by a veterinarian might be unnecessary. So, okay, let's see what we're dealing with. Is the trauma justifiable? Looks like he's just emaciated. Okay, well, let's start feeding him, get him under adequate UVB and heat, see if that perks him up. If that doesn't work, then it will definitely need to be a trip to the vet. So having that kind of triage in place and a plan of action. Hi, Snake in the background of Lori's screen. I was able to take action. And fortunately, it was just a case of emaciation. There was nothing worse going on with good high heat, good strong UVB, good food, properly dusted. He fattened up like that and became a lively, healthy, active sandfish skink within a couple of months. It was amazing. But the two stories right there, you see a big difference of prepared rescue based on, knowledge and resources, and unprepared rescue. So it's not just getting a reptile new, but getting one used or rescuing one. You really need to have the knowledge and the funds to be able to take care of it properly and be able to have that self-control to say no.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yeah, that is so key. I see so many people that get themselves into bad situations by continuously rescuing animals, and it just you end up doing more damage on your own finances as well as the animals that you have, not to mention like the biosecurity goes out the window because you're bringing in who knows what all over the place. So I think we've done a really good job covering the lifestyle and the finances. I think if you've listened to it up to this point, you should have a good grasp on that. But the other thing I really wanted to cover today was the actual animal. Which animal is going to suit you? Because every species is a little bit different. Like obviously this is where size does come into play a little bit. But when Tyson and I recorded the conversation a couple of weeks ago, we talked about using natural history. Like what do you want to see from that animal? What pet do you want is really the question. I know, Laura, you've spent some time thinking about this as well. So maybe you want to start this off and then we'll kind of rip around the table.
Yes. And before I forget, my friend Summer Mitchell, she just did about a 5-minute video on what's the best pet snake for you. And it isn't the typical, these species are the best pet snakes. It was a very good video that highlighted the best pet snake for me may be different than the best pet snake for you, because it all comes down to what your expectations of that snake are, what you want that snake to do for you, and what you can do for it. And you need to know things like what size snake is going to be appropriate for you to have. What can you comfortably handle, feed, and house? What do you want that snake to do? Do you want one that's going to burrow? Do you want one that's going to climb? Do you want one that you can see most of the time? Or are you okay if you get a species that you're hardly ever going to see? And there are just all of these factors to consider about the animal's natural history and their species typical behavior, and making sure that those things are going to match up with your expectations. We have many species of snakes here, which I'm fine with because I'm studying behavior. But honestly, we have some species here that if I was just having a snake for my personal family member, my personal pet, I wouldn't be happy with because they don't suit my personality. And I feel like the temperament and personality of the species really needs to suit what the person wants, because if they're not happy with that animal once they get it home, then they're going to want to get rid of it and rehome it. Or they're not going to be happy with that one, so now I have to get a different one to satisfy my needs.
Yeah, those are such good points. And I mean, I'm with my rainbow boa. I love that snake. It's a great snake, but I just do not see it. I am a morning person. I do not stay up past 10 p.m. This snake comes out at 11:30, 12 o'clock, 1 in the morning, and she cruises around. I'm going to have to buy a night vision camera in order to see this snake because it just doesn't happen. And I remember telling this story on, I think the podcast Lori and I recorded together. I remember being in one of the chain pet stores and somebody, I forget if she was returning her crested gecko or just coming to the reptile store to buy another gecko. And she was saying, I'm disappointed with my crested gecko because I don't see it because it's nocturnal. It's nocturnal, so you don't see it. And I thought, how weird is it that she bought that animal without even realizing its pattern, like, behavioral pattern. I obviously knew the rainbow boa was nocturnal, but she's a way more nocturnal than I kind of expected. And I love the snake. I'm not going to get rid of her, but had someone had told me before, I probably wouldn't have got her. So Tyson, what do you have on this topic?
So obviously where you live in terms of your climate, like your current climate, this comes into money as well. Like in Australia, where I live, in the winter in my room, it doesn't get below 20 degrees Celsius, which is a pretty good low end temperature for a lot of reptiles. Majority of species that I keep are sort of more arid or higher humidity. So those temperature levels really work, spending a lot on heating or cooling. Like in terms of the room itself, my ambient temp. So, if you're in I don't know, like, snow is really foreign to me. So if you're in like Alaska or Colorado or something, maybe keeping more arid species is potentially not right for you, because you're going to be spending a lot of extra money and to maintain those heats that you require. And then size, obviously, it's all about ability. So like I said before, with the enclosure size at the larger end of these animals, if you're keeping a retic, can you build an enclosure required for it? So a lot of smaller animals, bearded dragons, and a lot of the smaller monitors and smaller snakes, you can essentially buy store-bought enclosures for, or a custom enclosure that is a smaller size, which is much more in your budget. So I would start around those sort of animals. And then when it comes to natural behavior, I mean, you can get a bearded dragon. You can mix some cocoa peat or some cocoa fiber, and some sand together to make a substrate, and you can stack a few rocks and put a branch in on an angle, and you're going to get most of the sort of natural behaviors of a bearded dragon quite simply. You're going to get it digging, you're going to get it climbing, you're going to get it basking. When it comes to like a common tree snake, for instance, where you actually need to use a much higher enclosure, much more sort of detail in terms of getting its natural behaviors out, then, that's kind of a more advanced sort of natural behavior sort of level. Anything to do with water makes things endlessly more complicated. So I know all these people, I find it really strange, like people put fountains in their bearded dragon enclosure and stuff like that. Like, I saw a website the other day that was like, yeah, they live in the woods. It's just like, and they swim in creeks. It's just not true. It's just not true. Like Ackies, for instance, like you want to have a water bowl, but they get their humidity from under the ground. Like they're not swimming in creeks and watering holes and things like this. It's just not really necessary. So anything to do with water, you got to understand, like, they're like, oh, I want a pond, I want a water feature, I want fish. And it's like, you're giving up so much floor space for this aquatic area. Is it really required? Like in a 3-foot enclosure, to have a pond that you can put a fish in, you're going to use all 3 foot, plus all these sort of extra things required to maintain the water, filter the water, aerate the water. So yeah, definitely ability comes a lot into it. Budget, like we've already said, but yeah, like finding an animal that gels with you, your lifestyle, it just requires a lot of research. And then asking people, and not the people at the pet shop. Like, find your local community, find your local. You guys are going through a massive thing over there with like USARC and whatever, and joining your reptile associations, and I suggest people do that here too. I belong to that AHS. I try and go to meetings a bit more often now. I pay my membership for that, and those people will talk to you. They have a vested interest in getting you further and deeper into the hobby. So don't ask people at the pet shop. So this is something I get at the moment. Generally, if you keep reptiles, people around you know that you keep reptiles. Then they tell someone, they overhear one of their friends saying, oh, my son wants to get a lizard. And then they go, oh, I know, I'll call Tyson. Maybe he can help them buy a lizard. I talk to this person, I say, look, this is what you need, this and that, I can help you. And then the next day they'll be like, oh, I went to the pet shop and bought an enclosure. How do I set it up? And it's like, well, I don't like, now you're just stealing my time. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, you know, so use the resources that you have around you, get involved in the community before you buy the animal. And then you're actually going to get real people's experience. You know, if you're buying a rubber boa from a pet shop, they're going to say, oh, it'll come out in the day sometimes, or they just give you some bogus information just to sell you an animal. And it's not that they are, you know, we all know people that work at pet shops that really love the reptiles, and they're trying to give you the best thing that they can, but they also need to keep their job. Mm-hmm. So they're gonna, you know, it's sales. You're gonna have to bend the truth slightly just to get that animal or enclosure out of the door, no matter which way you want to spin it, you know. So
yeah, it's so true. Surrounding yourself with expertise is so huge, and I really like just that concept of understanding the natural history. If it is an animal that needs a huge water space, then it might be something you want to reconsider. Or, you know, the look and the appearance of the animal shouldn't be the top of the list.
Definitely.
It needs to be, how are you able to provide a setup that allows the animal to exhibit its natural behaviors? And you can actually find, I mean, if you want a green snake, for example, you can find nocturnal green snakes, you can find diurnal green snakes, you can find ones that live on the ground, ones that are arboreal. So you really have a lot of options, but you just can't gravitate towards the first one that you like. Sort of like what I did with my rainbow boa. I love the way that snake looks. It's so cool. I wish I could see it. I just look at pictures of it, I guess.
Look at sorry, you know, like the dragon snake. When I first saw the dragon snake, I was like, whoa, this thing is awesome. I'm thinking like a 6-foot snake with all these bumpy scales and a cool head. And then you realize it's like yay big and can't stay alive to save itself. Like, like it's like one of the coolest looking snakes, but probably the last snake I would ever want to keep. Like, it sounds kind of boring, you know, like you got to make sure it's moist all the time. You're not going to see it. Like, if that's what you're into, power to you, go for it. But for me, it's just not like, the challenge is not a challenge that I want.
Exactly. Yeah, that's so true. Some people they would love that. They'd be just invested in that experience. But if you want if you want to be able to walk into your room and see the animal doing what it does in the wild, then that's probably not the best, unless you're out there at nighttime with a flashlight. Mariah, did you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah. I get asked this question quite a bit, actually, through Reptifiles. Is I want to get a reptile, what would be the best fit for me? And usually these people are very new to the reptile sphere, because once you're in the reptile sphere, you can't stop that. That's cool, that's cool, that's cool. I want it. That happens very quickly. So usually with beginners, I just recommend basic things that are easily accessible, easy to house, easy to find information on. But even for more experienced keepers, you need to consider handleability. How important is that to you? Like, do you want something that will take a lot of work to get to the point where it will trust you to have a physical interaction without scaring it? Or are you more of the mind of you want something that is going to acclimate to your presence really quickly, is going to be more forgiving of mistakes, is going to be something that you can let your 4-year-old hold, supervised, of course, but something like that. And that's, you know, the difference between right there. That's the difference between, say, like I can't think of the common name, a boiga, and a ball python. So right there, age is something that always comes to mind for me. Are you comfortable with adopting an adult animal, or are you, for whatever emotional reason, determined to get a hatchling or a very young animal that you want to be able to raise and see grow up? And that's, you know, the difference between getting a baby corn snake, which I generally don't recommend for beginners because they are liquids, or an adult corn snake, which is much easier to care for, and you can often get one from a rescue. The size, yes. How much space do you have available? Like, do you live in one of those like 100 square foot tiny homes where something that lives in a 18 vivarium is seriously the most space that you can afford? Or do you own your own home? Do you have a spare room? Do you have extra space that you could actually fit something substantially sized into? Other thing, obviously cost, but we've already covered that. Nocturnal versus diurnal, those habits. Are you comfortable with, maybe only seeing your pet with a night vision camera? Or do you want something that you will definitely be seeing out and about during the day? Considering, again, how much you can spend per month, how much you can spend per year. Can you build an enclosure? Because if you can build, then all of a sudden something larger that requires a large enclosure that would otherwise be prohibitively expensive suddenly becomes a lot more possible. Some more unique things that came to mind would be your house climate. So say you have a room in your house that your house gets to 90 degrees in the summer, and for whatever reason, you do not have effective air conditioning to control that temperature. And I actually have a fair number of people coming to me with this problem. You can't get a crested gecko or a leopard gecko at that point, because that's beyond the point of heat stress for crested geckos. And that's basking temperature for leopard geckos. So that's obviously not going to work. On the other side of the spectrum, you have, say, let's pick a tropical warm weather, or say Uromastyx, okay? They are not cold tolerant. They really like things very warm. And you have your house getting to 60, 50 degrees at night during the winter. You're either you can fix that a little bit with nighttime heat, but there's a good chance that could cause problems for you, or at least additional expense. So it's something to be aware of. It might be better to have a more cold tolerant reptile, like maybe a bearded dragon, which can tolerate a good night dip. Brumation is another thing, actually. Some species will brumate no matter what. Other species should be brumated to perpetuate best health for them, or have some kind of winter cooling, and others don't need any kind of winter cooling brumation period at all. So are you okay with the idea of a species that you're not going to see because it's sleeping for months on end? That's boring. It is terrible. I have multiple animals that don't brumate, and yet when I have one that's brumating, it's torture, because I'm just sitting there like, when will you wake up and I can play with you again? So that's a big deal. Or are you okay with, having a turtle that you need to stick in a fridge for 3 months, and that's something you're totally all right with? Lifespan, speaking of turtles, are you okay with having a pet that can outlive you, like a sulcata tortoise? Or do you, maybe you're a teenager who wants a reptile, you are well researched, but you don't have a lot of time because you're going to have to move out to go to college. Maybe a chameleon is the best pick for you because they have really short lifespans, and that just seems to be a natural thing for them. So there's that. Rarity. Okay, so you found something in the pet store that you've never seen before. It's super cool. You also can't find any information on the internet about it because it is rare and is not often kept in captivity. Are you willing to put in the research required that it is going to take to figure out how to keep this animal alive in captivity? Can you house it outdoors? If you live in a nice warm climate where you can potentially house the thing outdoors, you have a backyard, you own your own property, hey, you could actually keep a larger species that does well outdoors. You have space, it's going to reduce costs in terms of like heating and UVB. It's really cool. But if you have outdoors as an option, that really expands what is available to you. And then there's time commitment. I like to compare tegus and blue-tongued skinks. I've fostered a tegu. I've had blue-tongued skinks for years. They are very similar, actually, in terms of general disposition and care, almost, actually. Thing is, a tegu is a 3 to 5 foot long lizard. A blue-tongued skink is 2 feet long. One can be housed in a reasonable size enclosure. The other one practically needs a room. One can be well supervised to, do its thing in the living room, and, you check on it every few minutes. The other one is like a toddler, and you have to tegu-proof the room. Like the disasters that they can get themselves into, or like they try to jump from the ground onto your windowsill, and all of a sudden the curtains come crashing down because their claws caught them. They're incredible. So do you have the time to work with and train a tegu like a dog at its own manners for dealing with your house, train it to just be with humans more often and be in your space? Or do you have less time but want something with a similar personality, which would be the blue-tongued skink? And that's something that you don't have to just work out with yourself, but if you're sharing that pet with anyone else, a sibling, a spouse, a roommate, you need to talk to them about their preferences too. Because my husband and I have different things that we want from the reptiles. I am happy with a beautiful enclosure. And if I can get a picture of it every once in a while and I get to study its behaviors, because, I'm at home all day, I can see things from them that you wouldn't ordinarily see outside of normal work hours. Cool. My husband works a normal 8-to-5 job. He's not super deep into the reptile hobby. He just wants a pet that, he can handle and he can watch and has the basic pet functions. So our ball python is extremely shy, does not come out very often for us to see. And so I'm like, all right, do your thing. As long as you're healthy, I'm just going to check out every once in a while to make sure that, you're still alive and that your body condition is good. But you have a nice looking enclosure, so I'll see you whenever I see you. And meanwhile, if she only belonged to my husband, I think he would have gotten rid of her a long time ago, just because he doesn't know if she exists. At this point, object permanence is in question. So being able to communicate with the other people that you're living with, the other people that you're sharing the pet with, and be able to come to a compromise of sorts on the animal that you're getting is very important.
Yeah, I think I really liked the lifespan for one is really key with reptiles, because most of these animals do live a long, long time. Like, it's just so crazy to think I bought my crested gecko when I was 16 and I'm almost 30 and he's still here, and who knows how long he'll be with me. It's like, I didn't know that when I bought him. And then energy level is another really important one too. Yeah, like the difference between a tegu and a skink is like a potato and a badger. One is going to be running around. It's going to want to put miles on a day. One is a lot slower in the wild. They're not going to be moving around as much. So yeah, those are great. I think what we talked about before we started recording is that we want to compile all these points into a simple checklist, because really this conversation is us just kind of bouncing ideas off of. So hopefully for the listeners, when they're listening now, we'll have a document that we'll kind of maybe all compile our heads on to try to put this all down into some nice bullet points. Lori, it looks like you have some things in your mind.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Okay.
I really do want to do a document that we can pool all of these considerations together, maybe call it options for consideration before getting your reptile, and put these questions that we've posed and all of these ideas and all of these things to think about ahead of time. It's just really important to me that when someone makes that decision to get an animal, that they're getting the right animal for their situation. And of course, there's no 100% way to guarantee that, because even within a species, there's going to be personality and temperament differences. Individuals are going to vary. And I use corn snakes as an example because we have 14 corn snakes, and I have a couple that are extremely outgoing and will climb right out of hiding as soon as you walk in the room and climb right out onto your hand as soon as you open the door, and they want to interact with the environment and with you, and they're very active. And then we have some corn snakes that hide all the time that I never see, and I have to set up puzzle feeders to entice them out to feed them. And then we have some that are in the middle, that are kind of just, yeah, I'm okay with stuff, but I'd also be okay with being left alone. And so even within a species, there's going to be individual variation with their behavior and personality. So I always hate to tell someone, oh, get this kind of snake or this kind of dog, and then they get that one that doesn't fit the norm, that doesn't fit the average, and they're disappointed with it. So I have to give that disclaimer. But I think it would be nice if we could come up with sort of some options for consideration and a checklist, and just help people be more prepared for when they get that animal and pick the right one, and be a little bit more informed about picking the right one, so that then they're less apt to be disappointed with that animal and they're less apt to rehome it, because rescue is expensive. I'm the director of Spirit Keeper Equine Sanctuary, and prior to that, I worked for an animal rescue, and I work very closely with the Rocky Mountain Collie Sheltie Rescue, and rescuing animals is expensive. And when people see, 501c3 nonprofit, they just think that we have money because people are donating, and that's not true. People do donate some, but I pour so much of my personal money into the rescue. And when we do fundraisers, sometimes I sell personal collectibles to raise money for the animals. Like, I've sold my entire Star Wars collection to raise money for the horses, because they're more important to me than those things. But I'm telling you, rescue's expensive. And when you as an individual commit to an animal and then decide down the road, I don't want it now, I'm just going to give it to a rescue, or I'm going to rehome it, you're putting that burden on somebody. Mm-hmm. And it's not an easy burden. And rescue is generally more expensive than getting an animal initially as your first pet.
So true. So our goal is to stop that as much as we can with this conversation. Hopefully we can give everybody the tools. If you are somebody who doesn't even have an animal yet, give you the tools that you don't end up in that situation, because it's so true. You bring an animal into your home, and then if you're offsetting it onto somebody else, you're really just shifting the burden to somebody else, and you get to wash your hands of it. But now somebody like Lori is selling off her Star Wars collection to care for an animal that someone no longer wants. And so what we'll do, I think, is I'll edit this and I'll make sure you guys all listen to it so we can compile and work on this list together. So before we release it, so listeners weren't kind of, as you're listening, you know that the document that's going along with this podcast is something that we've kind of bounced back and forth between each other and refined it into sort of the key points. Is there anything else that anybody wants to say as a closing point? Because we're already almost at 2 hours in, and I think we've covered a lot. And I think this is going to be very valuable to people. Whether or not you have one animal, you have 0 animals, or you even have a collection, you're starting to rethink. Maybe you shouldn't go get that another animal at the expo next weekend because you want to consider some of these things. So, is there anything that somebody wants to say? Tyson, you're good. Lori, you. So maybe Mariah, you good too?
I just want to say, focus on the animals you have and being happy and content with them, and celebrate those animals that are already living with you and that you're sharing your life with, and work on ways that you can interact with them more, or give them more, or find more value in what they're offering you, versus thinking the solution when you get bored is to run out and get another one. I find so much gratification in spending time with the animals that are already here and giving them more and more behavioral opportunities and watching what they do with those. I really find it rewarding. And I think if somebody would just stop and take a deep breath and pause and really focus on those animals that they are sharing their homes with, they would find a lot of value and reward in that. And don't be impatient and think, well, I need another animal. You already have this animal, so try to be appreciative of it.
It's so true. And that it's almost like a fountain of youth in a way. When you do improve the care for your animal, you get to watch this new behavior, and every time you come into that room, you're rewarded with it. The reward that you get from getting the new animal is short-lived, because it soon becomes a responsibility and an expense, like we've already talked about this entire podcast. But when you make a change in your reptile room or make a change in enclosure, it's just so rewarding to watch that animal interact with it. And I know Tyson the other day was sharing the common tree snake that he has, and he's mentioning that one of his favorite parts about that snake is that it does so many different things, and you can walk into that room and see it either swimming or climbing, and that is rewarding as a keeper. And that's exactly right, Lori. I think appreciate what you have, and how can you improve what you have before thinking a new animal is the answer. We will always want new animals. There's no question. Unless maybe Lori has 70 or 80 snakes, you might be at the cap. But I think the rest of us are always going to be yearning for more animals. So I don't think that feeling goes away. But you can definitely redirect it into something that's more positive for you, the keeper, and the animals that you currently have. I think, is that it? Have we hit everything?
What's interesting? Sorry, what's interesting about the excitement from a new animal? I actually feel stress. When I get new animals, I'm stressed. Mm-hmm. Like, trying to do the things the way I do, it requires a lot of time and yes, a lot of money, which I have to work for. So trying to work to make the money to then spend and then use the time to make the enclosures. New animals for me is highly, actually quite stressful. It's the after I've got the enclosure done and ready and I've seen the animal in it and I know that it's happy, that's when I take a deep breath and I sit on my couch and I actually enjoy it. So
yeah, that's so true. It takes a month or a couple of months to learn the animal, and then you're comfortable with it. But those first few months of a new species is always stressful. Mariah, I'll give you the closing words here.
No pressure. I was just thinking. Well, first, yeah, I feel the stress too. Like the better my husbandry gets, the more stressful getting a new reptile gets. Totally,
definitely.
It's very fun at first to anticipate building this amazing enclosure, but then you look at the work in front of you and you're like, okay. So there's definitely stress involved with it. And you're just kind of like, maybe I shouldn't get the reptile, which is worth considering. But when you mentioned reptile expos, Dylan, part of me just like shriveled up inside. I was like, oh yeah, expos. I love expos. They are so much fun. You get to go and talk to other reptile keepers that, and over the course of years, you build relationships with the vendors and you can just float around and spend the entire day talking to people, seeing amazing animals and, seeing traveling vendors who have really unique reptile supplies that you wanted to check out what their latest thing is. But at the same time, reptile expos are one of the biggest causes of impulse bought reptiles and thus rehomed reptiles. There's always a floating joke in my local reptile community of, all right, the reptile expo is over. Who wants to place bets on when we start seeing the ads start going up on KSL? Because it happens every single time and it is so sad. And fortunately, it's usually the more common species that are cheaper and that people buy on an impulse, like a bearded dragon or a leopard gecko or a crested gecko. But you really need to be aware of your weaknesses, and you need to prepare accordingly. If you know that you are going to impulse buy an animal at the expo, you better come with a fat wallet and the readiness to buy everything you need for that animal at the expo or shortly after so that you can get it set up properly that day, not just do something temporary until you finally get around to doing something better. Like once that's how my husband and I got our morning geckos. Was they were on sale. It was like the end of the day. The vendor dropped the cost, and my husband really wanted morning geckos. So he saw them. He's like, "They're $15 each. Let's get 2 of them." And I'm like, "All right." And so we do. And I think we ended up drilling some holes in a tote. Yeah, it was like a little storage tote that holds like manila folders. We drilled some holes in the top and we put in some dirt and a couple of twigs. And that was our morning gecko's home for the first while. And they can survive at room temperature. And they're very small, so they can survive those conditions for a while. But that clearly was not optimal. And that was a very patch job of trying to catch up with our impulse buy. If you know that you can't avoid buying an animal on impulse at the expo, and this works for pet stores as well, by the way, then don't go. Or leave your wallet in the car. Don't look at the reptiles. Do something, whatever it takes, to not buy the animal, because it's going to put you in a bad place financially. Probably it's going to be bad for the animal. It's going to be bad for you in general. Like, there's nothing good that comes out of that momentary thrill of buying a new reptile. So be aware of your weaknesses, be aware of your individual situation, and act accordingly.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think a good point to wrap up on is, as you increase your care, the more resistant you are to impulse buying. And that's kind of the underlying message that we're giving here, because you think, okay, a new animal is realistically $1,000. You know, all said and done, enclosures, lights, everything, food over the first year, you're probably going to spend $1,000. So the more, if you're just using a simple rack system, it's easy to make that impulse purchase because you're literally thinking like, hey, a 10-cent deli cup and I'm good to go, and a heat mat. But if you're someone who has really invested the time into creating an environment for that animal, it's really easy to walk through a pet store and go, well, I don't want that. Even though that's super cool, I would never buy that right now. I don't want that because it's just way too much money. So anyway, this was a fantastic conversation. Like I've said, we're going to put the checklist that we come up with over the next couple weeks in the show notes. So please download it and use it. And hopefully that can kind of circulate around the community. And it's also a continuing conversation. This is something that's not necessarily written in stone. We're just going to have it started. And as we come up with new ideas, we can always add to it. So thank you all so much for spending this Saturday afternoon / Sunday morning with me. And, this is another great, I know people really love the round table, so I was happy to get this one in. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that is the end of that episode. Lori, Tyson, and Mariah, thank you so much for joining me. That was a great conversation. I think we did a good job of breaking down some of those really key factors that people should consider before getting a pet reptile. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you did enjoy that, make sure you give it a 5-star rating on the Apple Podcasting app, or on YouTube, give it a thumbs up. And if you do want to download the PDF that is a supplement to this episode that's titled Self-Assessment for Choosing the Right Pet Reptile, make sure you head to the YouTube description or head to animalsathome.network.com, click on the roundtable link at the top, and then click on this episode and you'll be able to download it there. Again, this is a great short PDF, just 3 short pages with a few questions and bullet points that essentially breaks down this entire episode really simply and briefly, and it will help you make that decision on whether a pet reptile is right for you, and if it is, what species should you choose. As always, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you are enjoying the show, make sure you check us out on Instagram at animalsathomeca. That's where I post where all the episodes, or when all the episodes will be posted. And if you are interested in joining us on Patreon, make sure you go to patreon.com and just search Animals at Home and you will find us there. I will talk to you guys next week.